Can people see my screen? Does this work?
Yeah.
Yes, that's work.
Yeah, okay. All right. So this bit is a little bit of a review. So I would just want to talk for a little bit about, so how do we compare evidence? So before I get into specific standards we can use, just some quick background on why we even use evidence and what makes a piece of evidence good. So the simplest answer is any evidence is good evidence that helps you win the debate. That's pretty obvious, but the reason I want to say that specifically is because in my belief, there is no such thing as a piece of evidence that is always bad. I do not think there is such a thing, right? Some evidence will be good in some situations. Other evidence will be good in other situations. And of course, you're going to have evidence that's usually better than other evidence, right? Like it's always better to have a qualified piece of evidence than a non-qualified piece of evidence, right? If the two pieces of evidence are the same and one's more qualified, of course the qualified one is better. But you always want to look at the whole picture at once when deciding whether a piece of evidence is good. Look at, does it have a good argument? Does it really explain really well the logic or the warrant or the data behind the argument? Is it qualified, right? You want to look at all of those different things together and not just look at one thing. So answer the big question, does it help you win the debate? And if it does, it's good evidence. So how can evidence help you win a debate? So very simple. The most obvious one is you want to use evidence to support your claims. So we talked about this in Toulmin's model. If you have a claim and you don't have anything behind your claim, you haven't really said anything, you haven't made an argument yet. So we want to have evidence to support our claims so that we can have something to lean on other than just what we believe. The second purpose of evidence is to evaluate arguments. So this one is a little bit trickier. So do you remember when I said that in the later part of a debate, so in the summary speech and in the final focus speech, because of time limits, you can't focus on all of your arguments. You have to pick and choose your best ones. Does everyone remember that? So evidence helps you do that because as the debate is happening, evidence is something you can look at to kind of figure out, like, are we winning this issue or are we losing this issue? Are we behind? Or are we ahead? If we're behind on something, so maybe we have some evidence for something and our opponent has way better evidence, maybe if I'm giving a summary speech, I don't want to focus on that area so much, right? Maybe I will think to myself, okay, our opponents bested us on this issue. They have better evidence. They have the better support. So evidence is really helpful for evaluating and deciding during the debate what the best arguments are and which arguments are the most helpful to focus on. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the last thing that I would say evidence is good for, I mean, evidence is good for many reasons. So it's not like the last thing, but the last thing I'll say is that evidence helps us sound better. So does anyone remember, so Shanna mentioned this during the Toulmin's model conversation. So she talked a little bit about how we present evidence in a speech. Does anyone remember what the best way to present a piece of evidence in a speech is?
Is that primary evidence?
Yeah, so, well, primary evidence versus secondary is something Shanna talked about, but that's not what I'm asking right now. So let's say you have a piece of primary evidence and you want to cite it in your speech. You want to refer to it. So as you're actually giving your speech, how would you do that?
Don't remember.
After saying
remember?
our arguments and opinion, and brings up your evidence and ends up with like impact.
Provides the connection between the evidence and the
Yeah.
claim.
Yeah, you all are kind of that's all good stuff, but that's not quite what I'm looking for. So you bring it up, but like how? How do you bring it up?
After saying opinion and
Yeah, but like
arguments?
what?
Oh, I see.
But like
I see.
what do you literally do?
Wait, let me think about for a while.
Do you say the last name of the author and the date of publication?
Uh-huh. And what else?
Full citation?
You all are circling around it. I think you all know the answer, but you're just not saying it because it's too obvious. I don't want you to overthink it. So yes, you do want to explain the connection to your claim. You do want to explain the argument. You do want to provide a citation, but the way you introduce the evidence is by quoting it, right? So you can use direct quotations, right? Or you can use paraphrasing. Remember, those were the two options that Shanna talked about. So yeah, I can see by your faces there that you already knew that, but you were overthinking it. So no, I'm literally just asking, like, how do you do it? By quoting. And so one of the reasons evidence can be really good is that when you quote from an expert, they sound really good. Like they are a professional writer, right? So the sentences they write are going to sound better than the sentences you write. So if you get to quote your argument from an expert who probably writes for a living, that's going to make your speech sound better than if you just wrote it yourself. Make sense? So this is kind of why at the beginning I said it's all about the big picture of helping win the debate. Because if you're reading a piece of evidence because of how good it sounds, you might choose a slightly less qualified source because that less qualified source has a more flowery or expressive way of putting the argument that makes your speech sound better. Just something to think about. Any questions about any of that? Fairly straightforward, I think. Okay. So, given that, let's throw out some ideas. So let's say you have a piece of evidence and your opponent has a piece of evidence. I've already mentioned a few, but let's just get these on the record. What are some things you can use to compare two pieces of evidence? So you have a piece of evidence that says one thing, your opponent says the opposite. How can we compare them? What are some measurements we can use?
Authority.
Authority. Yeah. So authority is the evidence from someone qualified or is it not? Good. What else?
The date of its public or?
Yeah. So when was it written? Good. That one I will say you should be careful with because sometimes it matters when something was written, but because the date is the easiest way to compare two things, right? You literally just look at two numbers. A lot of times debaters will make publication date comparisons when they don't really matter, right? So like, let's say my study was published a month later than your study, right? And both studies are just opinion polls about about social media. Unless something really important happened in that month, nobody cares that my study is a month newer. That's not even worth saying out loud in the speech. So yes, recency matters sometimes, but make sure when you bring it up, you say out loud to the judge why it matters that your evidence is more recent. Nice. Any other examples?
Liability, because maybe some evidence from news that is funded by some investor or government. they'll be kind of not be in the neutral.
Sure, yeah. So reliability, or another way to think of that is bias. So if your source has a particular perspective, or even if they're an expert, do they have some kind of agenda? Yeah, reliability. Nice. What else? I know this is review a little bit because you all talked about, I think Shanna probably gave you an acronym if I remember correctly. She probably mentioned the CRAP test. But we want to go beyond that, dig a little deeper. So yeah, I think someone unmuted a second ago and I interrupted. What do we got? I cannot hear you if you're talking.
Hello? Can you
Hello.
hear me?
Yes.
Is it the test population?
The what now?
The test population.
Oh, so like, yeah, so that's, are you saying like how large, like how much data was collected?
Yeah.
Basically, yeah. So yeah, that's a good one to use. Again, it doesn't always matter. Like if your test has if one poll asked 1,000 people and another asked 1,100, that's not a difference that matters, right? But usually the more data a study has collected, the more kind of believable it is, or the stronger the support that it has for its claims. So that's usually a good way to make a comparison. If you have a study that asks lots of people or surveys lots of data, that is definitely usually going to be better. Any other ideas? Okay. I want to throw in some extra ones. So we've covered a bunch of these, but I like to think of evidence comparison in these two steps. So these first two, the first step is it relevant? So does the evidence actually address the issue? And is it qualified? So like, is this from an idiot on Reddit or is this from a professor? Right? So step one is kind of what a piece of evidence needs to meet before we even care about it at all, right? If a piece of evidence fails step one, then usually that's all you need to say. Like if your opponent read a piece of evidence from Reddit or from PTT, right? Is that the forum equivalent here? So if you read a piece of evidence from PTT, nobody cares about that. We shouldn't take it seriously. That's really all you need to say. If it's not relevant, it doesn't address the issue, that's really all you need to say. It's not related, so we don't need to care about the evidence. Step two, these are some of the more advanced and more difficult comparisons to make, but they can help you break a tie when two pieces of evidence both seem pretty good. One is the piece of evidence conclusive? So does anyone know what I mean by conclusive? Any ideas? No, that's okay. Conclusive means the evidence is trying to reach a conclusion about an issue. So those of you who have done some research before, you might have come across an article that sounds something like this. So there'll be an introduction where they'll say, there's a super interesting debate about whether, let's say, social media spreads fake news. So I'm going to review what the literature says. And here's a bunch of authors that say it does spread fake news. But here's a bunch of authors that say it doesn't spread fake news. So this is a really interesting issue, and a lot more research needs to be done. And the paper ends. So you might come across an article like that. And the point of an article like that is just to describe what all the experts have already said. It's not really making an argument. It's just designed to present the different sides. Now, you could cite an article like that and say, look, this article explains really well the pro side of the topic, so here's their explanation. If it's not conclusive, though, then the author is not actually trying to say that you're right. They're just explaining your argument for the purposes of people understanding what it is so they can research it. So they're not trying to reach a conclusion. A conclusive piece of evidence that takes a position on the issue is going to be better than a non-conclusive piece of evidence that is just describing the argument without really saying that they support it. Does that make sense? Okay. Causal. So causal evidence is better than non-causal evidence. So remember when Shanna was describing fallacies, one of the fallacies she mentioned was the false cause fallacy, I think. That's what she called it, or correlation rather than causation, right? So causal evidence is kind of the gold standard for all types of evidence in public forum debate. Because no matter what topic we're debating, we're saying that the resolution causes something, right? Social media causes good things for democracy, or social media causes bad things for democracy, or maybe a policy change causes something good or bad. And if the evidence is describing a causal relationship, X causes Y, that'll be better than an evidence that is just describing something that's happening, right? So maybe, so think of this example, right? You have a piece of evidence that says, oh, we looked at social media and it looks like some of the news on social media is fake, right? Versus a piece of evidence that says social media actually makes the spreading of fake news worse because of the following reasons, right? That second piece of evidence will be better because it's saying social media causes something bad. It's not just saying like, oh, we looked at the world and it looks like two things are happening and maybe they're related. I don't know. It's like, they're not sure, right? So causal evidence is better. Comparative evidence is evidence that makes evidence comparisons for you. So everything we've talked about so far is an example of evidence comparison, right? But sometimes when an author is writing their article, they will start to make those arguments and explain why their scholarship or their writing is better than someone else's. On the social media topic, one of the kind of biggest studies on the issue of social media and democracy is a study that looks at 66 million social media accounts to try to figure out if social media makes people more likely to vote. And one of the paragraphs in the study says, our study is really good. It's way better than the other studies because of how much data we use, right? So you can make that argument anyway, right? You can say our evidence is better, look how much data it used. But the fact that your expert says it themselves is really helpful and makes the evidence better because you don't have to rely on your own credibility to make the comparison. You can rely on the expert's credibility to make that comparison for you. Does that make sense?
Wait, can you say the last part again about the comparison?
Yeah. So comparative evidence, it's evidence that's making evidence comparison within the thing you're quoting itself, right? So if your expert is already writing in their article, my article is better than people who disagree with me because 1, 2, 3, right? That's a comparative piece of evidence because it's already making comparisons between itself and people who disagree. And you can use that to rely on your expert's credibility when comparing your article to your opponent's, instead of just using your own credibility for your comparisons. Does that make sense?
Yep, got that. Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, okay.
Other questions about that? Comparative, I would say, is the trickiest one on this list. Okay, and the last one that I wanted to mention is the evidence well reasoned? And this is kind of the catch-all giant bucket category of, does the argument make sense? Like, who has a better argument? And the reason I bring this up is because a lot of people are nervous to challenge other people's evidence, right? Because your opponent's quoting a professor. So if a professor thinks that your opponent is right, like, how can you, a student, disagree with your opponent who's citing a professor, right? It's important to move past that, because just because your opponent is citing someone qualified, that doesn't mean they're right. Qualified people are not always right. You know that because you have your own evidence that says the opposite and is also qualified. So you have two qualified people disagreeing, so someone must be wrong, right? So it's up to you to make the evaluation and tell the judge the argument or the warrant in my evidence is better than the warrant in my opponent's evidence because reasons, right? Don't be nervous. It's okay to say your opponent's evidence or your opponent's article that they're citing is wrong, even if they're quoting someone super smart. That's what debate is all about. So that's something that I've noticed, so that's why I want to put this up here. Everything your opponent says, you should be happy to disagree with. Questions about that? Okay. Most of this we've already talked about, but the thing I want to highlight on this slide is these useful phrases. So these are some phrases you can use to make comparisons between pieces of evidence in your speech. So in the actual debate, remember when we had our card activity where we practiced flowing? So phrases like this can replace, can take the place of those cards, right? Of those playing cards. So where in our activity we said their six of hearts argument is wrong because jack of clubs, instead we would say something like their argument is worse than our argument because their argument uses a small set of data, whereas our argument uses a large set of data. That matters because their findings might be a fluke or a statistical anomaly, whereas our findings are unlikely to be that because of how much data we have, for example, or any of those other issues or comparisons that I just went over. And again, you don't have to use these phrases as the template, but this is just a suggestion if you can't think of what to say. These phrases and filling in these blanks is a good way to start thinking about it. Questions about any of that? Okay. So I want to do an activity with you to practice this. So what we're going to do is, let's see, do I have, yeah. So if you click on the breakout rooms button, you should see a list of different breakout rooms. So it should say like students group 1, students group 2, stuff like that. Do people see this?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So in a second, I will ask you to split up into breakout rooms to do this activity, and then we will reconvene to share our findings. So, oh no, where did my go? Oh, there we go. Okay. So everyone click that link in the chat. There's a bunch of different evidence in here, but for our activity here, we will just do evidence comparison number 1. Okay, so there's 3 examples in here. We're just going to do number 1. Okay, so what we have here, we have 2 pieces of evidence that disagree with each other. Evidence A says that having democracy stops war. It increases the amount of peace in the world. Evidence B says no, that's not true. Having more democracy does not result in a more peaceful world. It does not prevent war. Okay, so these 2 pieces of evidence, these 2 articles, are disagreeing with each other about this issue. So what I want you all to do is split up into your breakout group. So you all know which group you are supposed to be in, right? If anyone does not know, give me a clap.
Just the same as yesterday.
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
The same as yesterday, but our team usually lost a lot of people, like 4 or 5 of them.
Yeah, if you for this one, as long as we have more than 1 person, you should be okay.
Okay.
It doesn't matter how many people, as long as you have a group to work with. And if you don't have a group to work with, so like if you're the only one here from your group, just click on another group and join them. So people in even numbered groups should say evidence A is better than evidence B, and people in odd numbered groups should say that evidence B is better than evidence A. Is everyone clear on what we're doing? So we're splitting up, we're doing evidence comparison number 1. You and your group should read through the evidence and try to come up with an argument for why your side's evidence is better. Yeah, make sense? Okay.
Okay, so
I will give you all
sorry to
10
interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt. So I just
Yeah.
want to make sure if my group is group 6, I need to say evidence B is better than evidence A. Is that correct?
If your group is group 6, you need to say evidence A is better than evidence B, because 6 is an even number. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. You all have 10 minutes to do this, so we'll come back at 12:25, and then I will have you all share what you came up with. Sounds good?
Yeah.
And if you need me to move you, message the chat and I will move you to your breakout room. All right, I think we have almost everyone. So let me share my screen so we can all be looking at the evidence together. All right, so let's hear from some people. So let's hear from an even number group first. So does anyone want to tell us why evidence A is better than evidence B?
Okay, so our group can go first.
Sounds good. Let's hear it.
Okay, so we are group 6. So our claim is evidence A is better than evidence B. So if you look the evidence A, you can find out that in the evidence A, it has a lot of example, so it will make his claim more convincing. But if you look back to evidence B, it just want to attack evidence A and without statistic number or any example. So our group think evidence A is better than the evidence B. Yeah, that's our reason.
Okay, awesome. So evidence A uses some examples. Evidence B does not really use examples. It only really attacks what evidence A is saying. That's a good comparison. I like it. Let's hear from someone else. So a different even group. Why is evidence A better than evidence B?
Let me go first. And Larry Diamond, the author of the evidence A, is from Stanford University, while the evidence B is from the University of Warwick. And another is that evidence A gives a lot of example, while evidence B just stated out that all that evidence is weak and didn't give a clear explanation about why the evidence is weak. And also the author, Larry Diamond, was the founding director of National Endowment for Democracy, which is a U.S. government agency that was founded in 1983, and he also got a lot of award for his contribution to democracy research or anything else. So I think that the author Larry Diamond has a lot of authority and credibility.
Okay. So I like this. I like your argument about examples and explanations. So I think both of those are good. I also like your point about how the author has experience working with democracy promotion efforts, right? So experience could be something that matters more potentially than their job title, right? So like maybe one side is a professor, but if the other side has hands-on experience doing something, that could be really good too. Your comparison about which university they work for, meh, it's okay. I do evidence, Larry Diamond has a slightly nicer position. That's definitely true. Yeah. But I would usually stay away from saying like, oh, this university has a better like sounding name, like Stanford, it was super fancy. So like everything they say must be true. I wouldn't say that usually. But some of those other comparisons, really, really good. What else? Let's hear one more group. Tell us why evidence A is better than evidence B. One more group. Especially if you have a different reason than something people have already said. I want to hear it. No? People don't want to share? Okay. Evidence B, your side's taken a beating so far. These groups are really coming after you. Who has something to say to defend evidence B from all this abuse?
The fifth group thinks that the evidence B is better than evidence A because although evidence A gives some examples, but all these examples don't have data to prove that making a country democracy will really make these countries being peaceful. And also in the evidence A, the research say that there's no ever two democracy country happen war, but we have found some examples that two government which you can say are democracy did have war. So it's the evidence A use the example to explain that democracy will bring peaceful. We think they don't have strong enough evidence to prove that, because as our group think, the evidence A is more like a speech. They don't really give, yes, just like I said, they don't really give any data to prove that more democracy equal to more peaceful situation.
Okay, so Nice. So you're really focusing in on this data versus examples difference. And you're saying data based on lots of information is better than just picking a few examples and talking about them. Nice. Does anyone else have an argument for why evidence B is better? Different group, maybe? Evidence B.
I'm from group 7 and I want to talk about it.
Go for it.
We think evidence B is better because it compares different evidence and it compares like it says how evidence that supports that democracy promotes peace is not very good and not relevant. And it also, and I don't see the evidence, the publication date in evidence A. And I also think that evidence A is too emotional, and I think it is exaggerated, and some of its examples are like not real. Yeah.
Okay. So that was really, really good. I like that you pointed out that evidence B is making some specific attacks against evidence A. Like if you look over here, it says, here's one argument. It says, statistical studies show that there are other more powerful explanations for war and peace, and the impact of democracy is spurious. So spurious is a word that you might have looked up if you weren't sure what that means, but it basically means, it's back to what Shanna was saying with her correlation and causation thing. Sure, democracies might not go to war with each other, but that might not be because they're democracies. It might just be that countries that are rich happen to be both peaceful and democratic, or countries that trade with each other happen to be both peaceful and democratic, right? It might not be democracy at all that's causing peace. It might be something totally different, right? So that's what this author means when they say the impact of democracy is spurious, right? So that's a specific attack against all these examples. Like in this paragraph, the author says Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan are not democracies and they have all this war, right? But according to this person, no, that's not because they're not democracies, it's because they're poor, right? Poor countries are less stable, they're more likely to have wars. So of course, these poor countries are more likely to have fights, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I thought, yeah, that's a really, really good point. I also like your argument about how evidence A is really emotional and exaggerated. So evidence A clearly has an agenda, and some of these examples are a little silly. Like this evidence uses ISIS as an example of a non-democracy. Kind of weird because ISIS is obviously not a country. So why should we care what ISIS has to, like, what does ISIS have to do with anything? So nice, that's good. Okay, so putting aside what I told you to argue, let's get a show of hands. Who is more convinced by evidence A? Give me a, I don't know, a clap or something. No one? Who's more
It's
convinced?
not-
Oh, one person. Who's more convinced by evidence B?
Haha.
Shot.
Even I work for the evidence A, I think evidence B is more reliable.
Okay. Yeah, see, sometimes even the Stanford professor doesn't get all the marbles, you know? So nice. So some people support evidence, some people like evidence A still, most people like evidence B. The first week that we did this, I did the exact same pieces of evidence, and the teams that were assigned to group B couldn't even come up with one reason to prefer their author. They thought evidence A was so good, it was no contest, and everyone agreed evidence A was better. The reason I bring that up is, you know, the evidence is what you make of it, right? There are some things that evidence A is actually much better at. Like, you all are totally right. All these examples and all these explanations are really good, and they help explain the logic behind the argument. Like, evidence A has really good warrants in it. Evidence B has some good data, not really any warrants. It doesn't really explain the argument, right? We can fill in the explanations and kind of guess what evidence B is talking about, but, you know, the evidence isn't really good at providing that explanation itself. So evidence comparison is what will decide which piece of evidence the judge is more persuaded by. So if you have two pieces of evidence, they're both kind of good, it's in your hands. It's up to you which one the judge will think is more important. And the debating, regardless of the evidence, can be more, you know, it can be more important than what the article itself says. Questions about any of that? I see a hand raised. I'm not sure if you raised your hand to vote for your preferred card or if you have a question. Okay, your hand went down. Okay. Any questions? I know we went over. I apologize. The cross-examination thing went a little long. Sorry. Someone has a question?
Yes, I have a question.
What's up?
So when we talk about the evidence comparative, does it mean we should be the judge and choose which one of the evidence is more convincing? Is that
Well,
why?
You should make the argument during your speech, right? So you're going to have a piece of evidence supporting your position. Your opponents will have a piece of evidence that says the opposite, right? So in the debate, your job is to do what we just did, to figure out what is their evidence talking about, and then make an argument to the judge for why they should prefer your evidence instead of your opponent's.
Okay, understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anthony?
Yeah.
May I ask a question about the things that you mentioned, like about conclusive? Sure. About conclusive. When I read it back, I'm not really understand about the conclusive, about the evidence.
Yeah, so conclusive just means is the author just explaining the argument without supporting it themselves, or do they actually support the argument, right?
Okay.
So in this case, both of the pieces of evidence we're looking at are conclusive. Like, they're both supporting their argument. Like, Larry Diamond clearly thinks democracy is really good. Rensky, I don't know, Durenspleet thinks it's not that good. So these are both conclusive. A non-conclusive one would be if Durenspleet, for example, was saying, oh, you know, there's lots of people who disagree about this. Some people think democracy is good. Some people think it's not that good. Who's to say? We need more research. That would be not a conclusive piece of evidence.
Okay. Understood.
Yeah. All right. Nice. Awesome work. Hopefully people have a slightly better or more clear understanding of what we mean when we talk about evidence comparison and what it looks like in debates. You all made some awesome comparisons. So awesome work. Come back at 2, I believe, is when we're coming back from lunch. Yes. Okay. Everyone enjoy your lunch, and we will see you for the topic lecture at 2.
Thank you.
Yep.
See you later.